Hi, this is Greg McNeil. Thank you for tuning into our podcast. Before we start today's episode, I want to take a minute to tell you about our second annual fundraiser, a clam bake, on Sunday, October 15th. Like last year, we'll have a great selection of sports items in our silent auction, and this year we'll also be putting on a putting contest as well as a cornhole tournament. We'll also feature music, actually it's funk music, from the On the One Band. So join us on Sunday, October 15th at 4 p.m. and meet many of the people featured in the Cover 2 PPT podcast series. That's people, places, and things making a difference in the opioid epidemic. Now enjoy this podcast episode.
Welcome to the Cover 2 Resources podcast series, a podcast series about addiction and addiction education. My name is Amy McNeil. I lost my brother Samuel to a heroin overdose on October 23, 2015. He was 28. As a family, we thought we were prepared to help Sam fight addiction, but we were painfully mistaken. My family founded Cover 2 Resources in memory of Sam. Our mission is to arm others with the knowledge needed to best support a loved one struggling with opioid addiction. The Cover 2 Resources podcast is an ongoing series in which we interview experts in the fight against opioid addiction. It is made possible through donations and sponsorships from concerned individuals or organizations. If you want to help in the fight against opioid addiction, please consider donating or sponsoring the Cover 2 podcast. Go to cover2.org for more information. This podcast is available on iTunes, Google Music, Stitcher, and via RSS feed. Simply search for the full name, Cover 2 Resources, on your platform of choice. Thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Greg McNeil, founder of Cover 2 Resources. Recently, a journalist from the Washington Post did some analysis on the effectiveness of President Trump's promised wall to stop drugs from coming into the U.S. across our border with Mexico. It turns out, if the wall gets built, it may not keep drug smugglers from bringing illicit drugs into the country after all. Here to talk about U.S. President Trump's wall is the Washington Post reporter Nicole Lewis, who's done an outstanding piece on this called President Trump's Claim that a wall will stop much of the drugs from pouring into this country. So, Nicole, welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Good to be here.
Okay. So, candidate Trump made a lot of statements during his campaign, and you've cited a number of them in your piece there, such as the first one there, just to add on, tremendous drugs pouring into the United States at levels that nobody has ever seen before. This has happened over the last 3 to 4 years in particular, and the wall will stop much of the drugs from pouring into this country and poisoning our youth. We need the wall. It is imperative. So let's start there. How true is that?
So in short, it's there are two parts. He's right, on the one hand. A lot of the drugs come into this country through our border with Mexico, but a wall just won't stop them, flat out. Wrong.
And why is that?
It's because most of the drugs that come in are trafficked. They make their way right in through legal points of entry. So drug smugglers fill up their cars, their trucks with these illicit substances, with heroin, with marijuana, and they drive them right through the border. And that's because, our borders are really dealing with getting a tons of traffic, over the checkpoint every day. And it's just impossible. It's so difficult to be able to screen out every single drug smuggler. And additionally, the second most trafficked way that drugs come in are through drug tunnels. And those tunnels go, for hundreds of miles through the ground, sometimes as deep as 70 feet beneath the surface, right across the border. And they start often in one house in Mexico and wind up in one house on the U.S. side of the border. And so, a wall, no matter truly how deep it goes, and the wall is only estimated to be about 6 feet beneath the surface, just won't stop those two methods. And increasingly, the DEA is showing that drug smugglers are using drones to fly drugs over the border as well. And so, no matter how high you go, you can't stop a drone from getting across and landing, inside of the United States.
So they put out RFPs already on this thing. Is that right? According to your article, there's a couple of different versions of this in their RFPs, and these walls would be between 18 and 30 foot high, and as you said, 6 foot below the surface. So
that's right.
This isn't going to stop anybody?
No. So the Department of Homeland Security is already hard at work trying to commission builders to build the wall. And they asked for 2 prototypes. One is the sort of typical wall that we've been hearing Trump talk a lot about. So a concrete wall, a concrete slab wall. And then the second is more of a see-through wall that's 18 to 30 feet high and 6 feet below the surface. And again, it's the very fact, and this is not me saying this. This is the DEA who releases a report on drug threats. They're saying that the majority of drugs just come right through legal ports, and so this wall is slated to be in the stretch of the border where it's sort of right now. There's a lot of wildlife refuges, and it's sort of just barren terrain. There's a river, sort of mountainous and rocky, and so there's just no evidence that we have that drugs are being trafficked across and through these areas. So again, one version of the wall won't do it, and a see-through version won't do it either, and that's just because it's just not how the drugs are coming into the country.
So it was projected that the cost of the wall by the Trump administration would be somewhere between 8 to 12 billion, and that, of course, would be paid for by the Mexican government. So let's fact check on that. What's reality?
Yeah. So, right. So initial estimates were between 8 and 12 billion. Right now, Trump's budget suggested 2.6 billion, and then that number was revised to 1.6 billion. But research shows that it would cost about $25 billion in order to construct the wall that Trump has described. And so this is a wall that's 30 to 45 feet high, primarily made out of concrete. And then an internal Department of Homeland Security estimate said that it would cost $21.6 billion. So, the current amount that's allotted for this project, $1.6 billion, just really pales in comparison to what folks think it will actually cost to build something like this.
So now I want to take a step back for just a second and talk a little bit more about the different ways that the illicit drug smuggling is taking place. You mentioned drones, you mentioned the tunnels. Let's talk a little bit about that, as well as, I suppose, cars that make it through.
Mm-hmm. So the DEA, as of March 16th, has discovered 224 tunnels since 1990. Most of those tunnels are primarily under the ground in Arizona and California. And I think one interesting thing that I didn't include in my article was that the DEA attributes a lot of these tunnels to the Sinaloa cartel, which most people, I think, may be very familiar with El Chapo, this figure, El Chapo Guzman. And, he was basically freed from jail or broke out of jail in 2015 through an elaborately built tunnel. And so it just goes to show you that, there's really no limit to the amount of ingenuity and sort of lengths that drug smugglers will go to figure out how to burrow under the ground, to reinforce these tunnels with wooden beams, to rig them with lights and air ducts. So again, a wall, if it's slated to go 6 feet beneath the surface, just won't have any impact on these tunnels that can be up to 70 feet below the ground. And then, additionally, we've got drugs coming in, right through the border of Texas and the United States, just being driven over. And so a lot of times, drug smugglers will, have sort of false bottoms to the cars or commingle the drugs alongside other legitimate goods. So that when the truck is inspected, everything kind of looks up to code, but you've got, heroin sort of stashed in there. And oftentimes, like the DEA is reporting that drug smugglers will sometimes dissolve methamphetamines or cocaine in other innocuous liquids and just bottle them up, take them right over. So that's, for those main reasons, that's why a wall just won't have any impact on the methods that we currently know through which drugs are coming into the country.
Can you give us a little bit more detail on how the drone situation works, how they bring them in with drone? I get what a drone is and everything, but I mean, a drone's pretty small, right? I mean, they're not huge, and they would have to be small to not go through and not detect it, one would think. So share with us that process.
Sure. Yeah, so right, exactly. So the drone technology we have right now is pretty small, pretty limited. And so it's not a primary way that drugs are being smuggled, again, according to the DEA. It's sort of small amounts of drugs that are put on a drone where someone can basically fly it, from the safety of their home, or, just they don't have to put themselves on the line in any way. And they can fly the drone right across the border and land it wherever they need it to go, presumably to a what we call a stash house on the U.S. side, so a place from which these drugs would wind up being distributed. But it's important to note that the DEA says as drone technology changes, drones may become more widely used. So if they can get bigger and load up with more drugs, it's possible that they could, see more drone use, more drone activity.
Sure. And of course, fentanyl and carfentanil, that takes up much, much less space and it's much lighter to transport. And
that's a really, really good point. Yes. So, exactly like you said, fentanyl, which is sort of a big threat right now in the opioid crisis, it does not take millions of pounds of fentanyl to you just don't need to traffic it at that level. And so drones could be a very effective way that fentanyl comes in. However, we do know, again, according to the DEA, that fentanyl primarily is purchased on the dark web and mostly from China and then sort of shipped via our mail system into the country. And so that's, another sort of avenue that they're trying to crack down on as well.
Yeah. So before we went on the air, you talked about how the wall is kind of an easy sell, call it, versus really digging in and tackling the challenges, the many faceted challenges associated with the opioid epidemic. Let's speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anyone who has access to the internet and who has talked to a friend who has access to the internet has probably heard about this wall, right? So it's just been a big selling point of the Trump campaign and of the Trump presidency. And so a wall, again, it's an easy sell because it's very clear. Did the wall get built or did it not? It's a physical thing that we can all kind of point to. And I think it allows Trump to say, well, I tried to get this wall done, and if it didn't happen, it's because Congress didn't want to fund it. And so you have a group of people that can be blamed. And without the sort of facts being laid out, it's hard to know, it might sound like a great solution to this crisis because, again, drugs are coming in from Mexico. It's just not through the method that Trump is suggesting. And so it seems like, oh, what a good solution. But it will have, virtually no impact on the opioid crisis, a crisis that's extremely complex, and that the roots of it, in truth, really started in the American healthcare system with the overprescribing of prescription painkillers.
Sure. So I want to talk for just a minute about another article that you did. You spent some time on Staten Island studying the opioid epidemic there and did some work. Tell us just a little bit about that and what you learned from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked on a podcast entitled The Fix that did a deep dive into the opioid epidemic in New York City. And I was primarily on Staten Island, reporting with, interviewing families and talking to people currently in treatment or people who had lost loved ones, as well as a few physicians, a few doctors who've been working to try and curb the crisis. And I think, something that really struck me while I was out there was just how much of a shared or a generational issue substance abuse is, and that it seemed as if that because this crisis is so large, because so many lives have been lost and affected, it's sort of bringing that conversation of substance abuse out into the open and onto the surface. So there's a lot of, there's something, if you can say that there's one sort of bright side or upside or something that, that we've gained here, it's in my mind, it's probably that people are now able to kind of to talk about substance use, to talk about addiction. We're asking ourselves, is this a disease? Is this a criminal justice issue? Is this a public health issue? There's just some great questions, I think, that are being asked that hopefully, we will have sorted out and get answered. But it seems like there's a lot of, really positive work happening there.
Kind of brought it out of the closet and got people talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, a good thing, no doubt. So back to your article. You conclude your article. I love the way that you concluded it, in fact. You end it by rating President Trump on the Pinocchio scale. So tell us a little bit about the Pinocchio scale.
That's right. So if folks are familiar with the sort of blog that I write for with the Washington Post, it's called Fact Checker. And one thing we do anytime we fact check a claim is we assign Pinocchios. And so, we gave Trump 4 Pinocchios for this, which is the max that he can earn. And so basically that means, he's made these claims. The wall will help with the drug crisis. It'll stop the drugs. And they're just not based in any kind of reality. Again, the White House, they didn't respond to say, here's the study or here's this. But as far as we can tell, we looked at the DEA report, we sort of run the numbers, and there's just no evidence to support his claim. And so we said, this is totally for Pinocchio.
So how does he pivot and move on from this? What happens next?
That's a great question. One thing I noted in the piece was that Trump actually commissioned a task force, so to speak, on the opioid crisis. And so they were charged basically with, presenting to him a sort of path forward for how to address this crisis in our country. And they laid out their points. They, came back with an interim report in July. And, I've dug into this report a little bit, and it seems like they've really done their homework. And so, they're asking the president to do things like address the overprescribing of prescription painkillers and focus on retraining doctors, or to address help the Department of Homeland Security and Customs, develop sensors that can detect fentanyl coming in through our mail system. So they're really trying to create a strategy that, that's dealing with the crisis as we know it's unfolding. So I think he can pivot by taking the advice of the commission that he's put together. They've done this hard work to try and come up with a solution or a set of solutions, and I think it seems like a sort of natural, very logical thing to do to say, okay, I hear you, I'm ready, and work with them to come up, with a functional plan. So.
Well, Nicole, I really like your work there. That's a great piece you did on the wall. So thank you for spending some time with us today to share some insights from your great writing.
No problem. Thanks so much.
What final thoughts would you like to share with our listeners about the opioid epidemic and its potential impact that the wall could have to protect our country from illicit drug smuggling?
Yeah, of course. And I think the big takeaway for me is that I know as someone who's been covering this that people are really desperate for solutions. So many lives have been lost, and at times and in places it can feel like no one is doing anything to help. I can assure you, though, that the wall is not the answer. It just does not address both the complexity and the reality of this crisis. And so I would just encourage people, to keep that in mind. As Trump says, the wall, just, that it is not going to have the impact that he's trying to sell, and to, start thinking about what $1.6 billion, the amount of money that's slated to start this construction on the wall could actually do. So how could it impact treatment? How could it impact, training and advocacy and all the kinds of complex sort of needs and services that the communities are sort of lacking or asking for. So those are my final thoughts.
Once again, thank you, Nicole. We've been visiting today with Nicole Lewis, reporter for the Washington Post and fact checker. And she has done a thorough job of checking the facts on President's claim that the wall will stop much of the drugs from pouring into this country. My name is Greg McNeil, founder of Cover 2 Resources. Thank you for joining us for this Cover 2 PPT podcast. That's people, places, and things making a difference in the opioid epidemic.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Cover 2 Resources podcast. This episode is a production of Cover 2 Resources and is made possible by listeners like you. With your support, the Cover 2 team can continue to research and broadcast these resources to others in need. If you'd like to donate or to sponsor a future podcast, please visit cover2.org. As always, thank you for listening. Together, we can make a difference in the opioid epidemic, one life at a time.